Cool. So I know it's only 9:27 or 9:28, but we've got a lot to cover this morning. So today we move into our final section before test number 3, which comes up on Tuesday, which is on personality. So I gave you guys the breakdown on Tuesday of the items for test number 3, 8 questions on intelligence, 11 on development, 10 on emotion, stress, and health, and 11 from this personality section. I'll try to give you guys some tips and pointers as we go today in terms of what I'm likely to emphasize and you're likely to see on that test on Tuesday. Same PAR score answer sheet, the red one. What is it? F289, I think is the number. We will start at 9:30. If you show up later than 9:55, you won't get a test. You'll have a 0. So we don't want that to happen. So please make sure you're there on time. So the lay of the land today is, in terms of personality, to begin with a definition, get us all on the same page, help us understand what it is exactly that we're talking about. Talk a little bit about nature versus nurture, because this has been a theme through part 2 of our course. So we'll be talking about twin studies and adoption studies like we did when we talked about intelligence, like we did when we talked about language development, and now we'll revisit it for personality. We'll talk a little bit about personality assessment, and what I like about that is it gives us an opportunity to bookend part 3 of our course, where we started by talking about intelligence assessment and discussing reliability, validity, and standardization. Come right back to that today and look at different approaches to assessing personality and their relative strengths or weaknesses with respect to things like reliability and validity in particular, okay? The majority of our time this morning, probably 45 minutes, from 10 till 10:45, we'll be covering the major theories of personality. So we've got 4 of them to review. We'll spend the most time talking about Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality, not because it's the best theory, but because it's got the most moving parts. It's the most complex of those personality theories. And in fact, some of the other theories that come after that on our review are really reactions to some of the criticisms of Freud's model. So you need to understand Freud, for example, if you want to understand Maslow and Rogers and their humanistic theory of personality. So that's the lay of the land in terms of how we're going to approach this today. So let's begin with the definition, get ourselves all on the same page, and then we'll be ready to roll from there. All right? So let me just navigate to where I got to get us to here, and let's begin with this little definition here up top. So personality, what do we mean by that? Characteristics, emotional responses, thoughts, and behaviors that are relatively stable over time and across circumstances. So if we parse this a little bit, right? Emotional responses, that sounds like feelings. Thoughts and behaviors, that sounds like the other 2 parts of our definition of psychology, right? The scientific study of behavior and mental processes, which we unpacked back on day 1 as to include emotional responses and thoughts. So this is at the core of what we're doing in this course, right? Emotional responses, thoughts, and behaviors that are stable. Okay, so these things are consistent. And I want you to notice where the stability manifests itself over time and across circumstances. So let's imagine a scenario where we have someone who, in terms of their personality function, tends to be a little bit shy. Well, this definition would say they have emotional responses, they have thoughts, and they have behaviors that are consistent with that shyness dimension. They've been shy since they were little, all the way through now their, let's say, early 20s. And that shyness manifests itself not just in one situation, right? Across different circumstances. So at work, at school, maybe at home with family members, they're relatively quiet and shy. What we're really getting at there with that definition is the idea of a personality trait. A personality trait is an enduring quality or attribute that you have that influences behavior across different situations. So a couple key elements to this definition, right? It's enduring. That gets to that consistency idea, right? It influences behavior, right? It is something that maybe we can't directly observe shyness in you, but we deduce that you are high on that shyness dimension of personality because we see behaviors that are indicators of that underlying trait, right? So it influences your behavior in different situations across different circumstances, right? Again, it's not just in one context. It's not just when you meet new people that you're relatively shy. It's over time. And in different kinds of situations, whether you know the people or not, you tend to be more quiet and reserved. Or maybe you tend to be the opposite. You tend to be pretty extroverted, pretty outgoing, okay? So that's what we're really going to be focusing in on as we talk about personality today. Really, probably more than anything, this idea of personality traits, right? These enduring qualities that we have that we see again and again over time in different situations. And in fact, these traits are probably the best way if we want to try to determine the degree to which personality is genetically or environmentally driven. We could try to measure these traits and then look at these traits as they relate to different degrees of genetic relatedness. And that's exactly what we do, right? When we do twin studies and adoption studies. So the good news is those studies have already been done, and we can very quickly and briefly summarize the results of those studies. The evidence from those twin studies and adoption studies strongly suggests that all personality traits have a genetic component, okay? Personality is genetically loaded, okay? How do we know? Well, we do twin studies. Look at the data we have over here. So we have monozygotic or identical twins in the green bars. We have dizygotic or fraternal twins in the orange bars. Let's remind ourselves about those guys, right? So monozygotic, we said, were identical twins who share 100% of their genes. Dizygotic, we said, were fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes, okay? So what's the pattern of the results down here? Well, look at the green bars. Every single time, in terms of the correlation between twin pairs, on these different personality traits down here, the more similar you are genetically, the more similar you are in terms of these various personality traits. So let's just look at the second bar here, second pair of bars, I guess I should say. Right? For extroversion, for outgoingness, people who are more similar, that is MZ twins, are showing higher correlations for that extroversion personality trait than are people who are less similar genetically. So what's the take-home message here? The take-home message on bullet point number 2 here, is that it may be that genes are predisposing us to manifest certain personality traits that are, again, associated with behavioral tendencies. So this is basically saying what we're seeing is the genes make it more likely that you do certain things, and we use those certain consistent behaviors over time to infer that you're high or low on neuroticism, or that you're a conscientious person or not, because there are behaviors that are good indicators of conscientiousness. And what's happening here is those genes are making it more likely that you are going to go and do those behaviors, like showing up on time, turning things in on time, being reliable, being thoughtful, not making silly mistakes when you work on a paper, things like that. Those are the behavioral tendencies that are indicators of this high level of conscientiousness, okay? How do we know when we look at the data over here on this entire slide over here? Let me just circle all the numbers. How do we know that personality is not genetically dictated? That there's not a trait that's completely heritable to a 100% degree? How do we know that? Tell me in the chat box. What do you not see? Or what would you have to see in order for something to be a genetic dictate? I'm trying to get at the logic here of the twin studies, right? This is connected back into what we talked about for intelligence. Non-zero similarity, if this was a genetic dictates, right? Yeah, Alexa's on it, right? If this was a genetic dictate, which of those would you expect to be positive 1.0, Alexa? the correlations for what kinds of twins would be positive 1.0 if personality was genetically dictated. Yeah, for those MZ twins. Excellent. So one final point here before I stop and see if there are questions on this information about nature versus nurture. And the final point is about temperament. There's a suggestion in this research about the heritability of personality that temperament early on, right? We referred to this when we talked about factors that might influence attachment before spring break, right? We talked about easy versus difficult temperament babies. So the suggestion here is temperament might give us an early glimpse at some of these personality features. In a baby's activity level, in terms of their emotionality, that is how much they cry, in terms of their sociability, how they respond to new people being around, we might be getting an early glimpse at how they're going to be on some of these personality traits listed on the bottom of the graphic over here on the right side, right? So neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and so forth. In fact, those are the big 5 factors that are at the core of the 4th and final major personality theory that we're going to talk about. And the suggestion is that early on, maybe in the first couple weeks or months of life, we might have a sense of what you might be like later on if we look at your temperament as it's manifested in those different aspects of your behavior. Again, activity level, emotionality, and sociability, right? So a baby who, in terms of extroversion, is going to be high on that dimension, probably is really bright and bubbly, and when new people come to visit, grandparents or uncles, they get excited to see them and they run over to people and all that kind of stuff, versus maybe a baby who's going to be more shy and quiet and reserved does the opposite of those things, okay, early on in terms of temperament. So again, the idea here is temperament as an early glimpse at what these personality traits might look like later on. All right. Any questions about the nature versus nurture issue as I'm framing it here? Makes sense, I hope. Good. All right. I'm not going to beat it into the ground. What was our list of things to do today? Talk about a definition, talk about nature versus nurture. Well, we're done 2 of those 4. That's the good news. The bad news is the rest of those remaining 2 items are going to take us more than an hour to get through here. So let's talk about personality assessment. What's going on here in terms of trying to measure, trying to quantify these personality traits that we've been talking about? Well, it turns out that there are 2 major approaches to doing this. The first is known as an objective testing approach, and it's embodied in something called the MMPI-2. I'll explain what that is in just a minute. The other approach is known as a projective approach to personality assessment, okay? And we'll contrast these 2 to each other. What I want you to be able to do by the time we're done is know what each of these approaches is about in and of itself, and know how it differs from the other major approach here. Well, objective tests are those that involve asking you to tell me something about yourself. So these are self-report measures where I ask you to describe different aspects of your personality. The MMPI-2 stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And believe it or not, it consists of 567 true-false items, okay? It's an objective approach because it's asking you to tell me about yourself, okay? So it's a series of statements like, I enjoy meeting new people, true or false, okay? Sometimes I prefer to be alone, true or false. Libraries are some of my favorite places to go, true or false, okay? Other people annoy me sometimes, true or false, okay? The good news is we're getting the information right from you directly. We're not doing some kind of inferring what's going on from some other kind of indirect means. And the good news for objective tests in terms of what we know is important for a test to have is that these objective tests like the MMPI-2 have very good reliability and they have very good validity. Okay, what does that mean? Well, remember, reliability is consistency. If you take the MMPI-2 today and you take it again in a month on May 6th, your scores are going to correlate pretty strongly. In terms of validity, when you look at these items and you look at the profile scores that you ultimately get, it's pretty clear that this is, truthfully measuring different aspects of your personality. Is it measuring everything? Probably not, okay? But in terms of validity, it's another strength of these objective tests. And this is going to be one of the major ways in which you can contrast the objective testing approach up here with the projective approach down below. Because as we talk about projectives in just a bit, we're going to see that they have relatively poor reliability and relatively poor validity. So if you ask me which way should I go if I'm going to do personality assessment, I'd be a much bigger fan of objective tests because they've got the good reliability and the good validity. If you want to sneak standardization in, everybody gets the same set of 567 items on the MMPI-2. Okay, and you say true or false to them. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, saying, okay, because it's self-report, isn't it possible that people lie? Absolutely. The good news with the MMPI-2 is that it has built into it a couple of validity scales. And these are basically items aimed at trying to catch people lying. And there are two ways you can lie on an objective personality test like this. You could do what's called faking good. That is trying to present yourself in an overly positive light and not admitting to, sometimes other people annoy me. And you're like, false, no one ever annoys me, right? Or you can fake bad and try to make it look like you've got some problems, right? So if I'm taking an MMPI-2, I'm sitting in my jail cell after murdering my entire family and I'm relying on an insanity defense. When I take the MMPI-2, I might be trying to skew my results to make it look like I'm a really troubled individual in terms of my personality function. The good news is the MMPI-2 will catch that. What the MMPI-2 ultimately derives is a set of scores across a variety of different scales. You do not need to know all of these details for the test. I just want to give you a sense of what this test involves. So the different scales with items that load onto them include depression. So if you score high on the depression scale, you'd say true to statements like this one. I often feel that life is not worth the trouble. On the paranoia scale, you would score high if you say true to the statement, several people are following me everywhere. For schizophrenia, you'd score high if you said true to statements like, I seem to hear things that other people cannot hear. Ultimately, what is generated with the MMPI-2 is a profile across these different scales. There are 10 of them total. Again, way more than you need to know. If you take a personality class, you'll learn a lot more about the MMPI-2. But it gives us a good sense of what's going on here across a number of different dimensions. Here's a depression scale. There's a paranoia scale. Here is psychasthenia, which is like an OCD type of scale. Social introversion, right? How outgoing and extroverted are you, or how sort of inward focused, inhibited and introverted are you? Okay, again, good reliability, good validity. That's the key take-home message here for the projective test like the MMPI-2. Let me stop there for a second. Any questions about this first approach to assessing personality? Objective testing. Okay, let's contrast these objective tests with the alternatives, these projective tests. So the projective tests are predicated on something known as the projective. That's hard to see. Let me make it not blue because I'm noticing that that color is making it difficult to see. They're predicated on something known as the projective hypothesis. And the projective hypothesis is a Freudian notion that basically says something like this. If I were to present you with any of a variety of different ambiguous stimuli, and those ambiguous stimuli could include ink blots, they could include pictures, they could include incomplete sentences. What will happen is that in response to these ambiguous stimuli, what you'll do is you will project things about yourself and about your personality onto those stimuli. So the project part of projective is kind of like a projector in a movie theater, right? Projecting the film onto the screen. In this case, you will reveal things about yourself, or again, you will project onto these ambiguous stimuli, the ink blots, the pictures, etc., things about yourself that you might not otherwise directly reveal to me, okay? So there are some famous projective tests. The Rorschach is the one that uses the ink blots. The TAT is the one that uses the pictures. TAT stands for Thematic Apperception Test, if you're dying to know what that stands for. So I'm going to type that in here. Thematic Apperception Test. I've got a separate slide on that one that we'll look at in just a couple of minutes here. Okay, so the Thematic Apperception Test as well. The big problem with these projective tests is that they have both poor reliability and they have poor validity. Again, what does that mean? Well, reliability, we said, is about the consistency of the test, right? The poor reliability for the projective test manifests itself in a couple different ways. You could have poor, it's called test-retest reliability. You take the Rorschach today, you take it again in a month, and my interpretation yields two very different depictions of your personality function, okay? That's test-retest reliability. Even more troublesome for the projectives, and the Rorschach in particular, is poor inter-rater reliability. So if 3 or 4 different psychologists or psychiatrists were to interpret your responses to the Rorschach, we may not necessarily get similar conclusions from them about your personality function, okay? Validity is, well, is my measure really measuring what I say it's measuring? Am I really measuring personality with how you respond to these ink blots? Might I instead be inadvertently measuring something like your creativity or your susceptibility to, peer pressure or social desirability, trying to make yourself look good to the person who's presenting you with this test, okay? These are some of the big criticisms. And again, I would majorly focus in on the poor reliability and poor validity, because that's not just some minor thing like, oh, they're not really good in that regard. Without good reliability and good validity, there's really not much value in doing the assessment that you're doing. Okay, so let's give you a couple of examples of what these items look like. I don't see a whole lot of benefits here. It's a different approach to assessing personality, but because of the poor reliability and poor validity, their scientific merit is not particularly great. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of some items from the Rorschach. So this is not a real Rorschach item, but it's similar to one. If I were administering this test to you, I'd be giving you 10 of these in a row. Some are just black ink on the page. Some, obviously, like this one, have color. I hand the card to you, and I say, what might this be? If you're willing to respond, you can just chime into the chat box. If you don't want to, you don't have to. So we've got people saying that it looks like a clown. Okay, good. What else? Anything else here? What might this be? That's all I'm allowed to say, by the way, in terms of standardized administration. 2 people holding hands, staring up at a sunset. These 2 people here. You might look at these things up here and say, hey, it looks like peeps. It's almost going to be Easter time. I see an angel maybe in the middle here. I see some upside down bunnies. You might see a butterfly. So if we turn the ink blot upside down, those actually do look like bunny rabbits. Okay, fantastic. Okay. In the second part of this test, what I typically do is I go back to this card and I say to you, so you say it looked like a butterfly. What makes it look like a butterfly? And maybe Kristen would say, in the middle here, it looks like, the shape here, they look like wings, and there's sort of a central part of the body here. Or this looks like 2 people because this shape looks like their heads. It almost looks like these are hands touching each other right there. Okay. Yeah, Kristen, I've been doing this long enough. I pretty much have heard every response to these with all the years that I've been using this item. Here's one from your textbook. You don't need to respond to this one because they've already sort of built in some responses. Typical responses. Look like 2 people. They're fighting over something, or they're collaborating. They're working together, carrying something heavy together. Those are 2 different kinds of responses, aren't they? Maybe one person's looking in a mirror. Well, you could say that's almost all of these slides because they're symmetrical. You throw ink on a page, you fold it in half, you're going to have symmetry down the middle, right? I also see a butterfly. Kristen might see a butterfly a second time here with the red shape in the middle. Okay, maybe some sort of rare red butterfly, let's say. Okay. So that's the Rorschach approach. The TAT, again, based on the projective hypothesis, you're going to project onto these stimuli different aspects of your personality. In this case, what I do is I present you with a variety of these pictures, right? So if something looks like this, or this guy over here, somebody's holding someone in their arms. And what you're told to do with the TAT is relate a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And your story should include some information about what the characters in the story are thinking and how they're feeling. And then we're looking for themes, right? Is there a repeated sense of doom and loss and depression and sadness? Or are there themes about danger and anxiety and worry? Or are there themes about feeling less than other people, something about self-esteem, right? Again, all of this going back to the central idea of these projective tests, which is what? That you are going to project onto these ambiguous stimuli something about your personality. Okay, that's the theory, at least, behind these projective tests. But as we said, they're hampered by problems that they have with reliability and validity. Okay? Let me stop there. Any questions about each of these two approaches to personality assessment? Could you recognize a description of each of them separately? Could you somehow do something that would involve comparing and contrasting them with each other? Would you be able to recognize something about why reliability and validity matter? Or why a standardized administration is important, right? Again, this is the bookend section of part 3 of our course. We began talking about reliability, validity, and standardization as it related in that case to intelligence. And now on the back end, we're looking at reliability, validity, and standardization as it relates to these personality tests. Got it? Any questions before we turn the page from the personality assessment discussion? All right, we're good. We got 15 minutes to get through our major theory. So the balance of our time together this morning, what I want to do is review these major theories of personality, and I'm going to begin by giving you some names to associate with these different theories, and then we're going to lay out the basic ideas of each theory, and then when we do that, we'll be able to then compare these theories and contrast these theories with each other. So let me bounce down to the slide that gives us the overview of the major theories. So let me give you a name for each of these. For psychodynamic theory, we're going to be talking about Freud. For humanistic theory, we're going to be talking about Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. With social learning theory, we're actually going to revisit our old friend Albert Bandura. Remember the Bobo doll guy? Yeah, we get to come back and look at what he theorizes is driving personality. And probably not surprising, one of his 3 big ideas is that personality is driven by observational learning, right? You learn to be outgoing and talkative in the life of the party because you've observed other people and now you mimic or imitate their behavior. The final model is Raymond Cattell. We've actually briefly alluded to his 5-factor model because those were the 5 traits on that slide with the data about twin studies, right? The MZ twins versus the DZ twins. This slide back here. These were Cattell's 5 factors, and we'll look at them at the end of the get-together this morning. All right, so let's begin by talking about Freud and some of his central ideas here. So let me get rid of my scribbling here. Some introductory notes first, right? Psychodynamic theories associated with Freud, that's not surprising. We know something about that already from our review of the Great Debates in the History of Psychology. At the core of his model is an emphasis on the unconscious. So basically, you know, a shortcut when taking the test and reading individual test items is if it says something about unconscious, it's Freud, it's psychodynamic, right? So Freud thinks what makes us tick in terms of personality, what makes us be the way that we are, is unconsciously driven, and it's about conflicts or discrepancies, if you will, between our desires and our actual experiences. And I would emphasize the desires in particular, because when you read about his model in the textbook, you'll see that one of the major points of emphasis for Freud is on sexual and aggressive desires and impulses. So there's a lot around that, right? These sexual impulses, these aggressive or violent impulses, these kinds of drives and desires. And he thinks that we can end up with some unconsciously driven conflicts and problems when what we want and what we're actually experiencing on an everyday basis don't map onto each other. Okay. His model also includes the notion of psychic determinism. What is that about? Well, I'll try to add a note down the bottom here, right? That nothing in terms of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors happens by chance. That's the central idea here with the psychic determinism notion, okay? Nothing in terms of our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors comes out of the blue, okay? So he would basically say there's no randomness in what we're thinking about and how we're feeling or what we're doing. We may not know. We may not have insight into why we're doing some of these things. But if we were to dig around long enough, or maybe if we were to go into psychoanalysis for long enough, we would be able to find the reason why we're doing or feeling or thinking the things that we're doing or feeling or thinking. It relates to the psychic determinism notion, by the way, relates to the idea of a Freudian slip. You guys ever heard of that term before? A Freudian slip, right? So a Freudian slip is a situation where you sort of inadvertently say something and it's sort of in a mistaken way. So maybe you meet somebody attractive at a party and instead of saying, I don't think we've been introduced, you say, I don't think we've been seduced. I mean, I don't think we've been introduced, right? Or you turn to your friend at this party and you say, this is the best part. I mean, this is the best party I've ever been at. Or maybe the example is like the one I built in on the next slide here, right? We've got this queen coming in to see the king, and instead of saying, good morning, beloved, she says, good morning, beheaded. Oops, I meant beloved, right? So no matter what is your favorite example, I'm thinking of the scene in Christmas Vacation when he's shopping at the like women's underwear counter. And there's a series of these Freudian slips as he's talking to the saleswoman. If you've ever watched Christmas Vacation, if you haven't, I don't know why you haven't. But that's another classic series of these kinds of Freudian slips. Again, the notion here would be those things don't come from nowhere, right? When you stumble upon the words like this, maybe you're thinking about how much better it would be if the king was beheaded and then you were in charge, for example, something like that. All right. What else does Freud have within his model? Well, if you had any AP Psych in high school, you might have learned something about the different levels of consciousness, right? And basically the model here is that the conscious level, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Let's try again. The conscious level behavior, there we go, is really simply, in this case, literally, right, the tip of the iceberg. Everything that you are aware of at the moment, if we're talking about your behavior, your thoughts, and your feelings, that's not really where the action is. This model would suggest that most of what's driving what you're doing is buried down below in this iceberg, right? So it's down here in the unconscious, right? Activity that's going on well below your level of awareness. That's the vast majority of the driving force behind your behavior, the stuff that's making you do what you do. Then obviously within this model, we've got the different structures and personality. So we've got ego, and we've got id, and we've got superego. We're going to talk about those three in just a couple of minutes here. But the point of this first slide here really is to emphasize the fact that this activity at the level of conscious awareness is really just a small sliver of what's making us do what we do. And again, if we really want to uncover what's going on, we're going to need to do some digging. And in fact, when we talk about psychoanalytic approaches to treatment in the last part of the course, what we're going to talk about is the fact that the goal of such psychoanalytic treatment is going to be to make this unconscious material conscious. Okay? We're going to talk about different approaches to treatment and what their goals are. The clear and central goal of psychoanalytic treatment, which is connected in with Freud's psychodynamic model of personality, is you want to bring this stuff up to the surface and gain insight into it. And it's only when you do that that things will get better, according to this model. Okay? So let's talk about id, ego, and superego. You guys probably heard something about these somewhere along the line. Let me just spell them out for you on our next slide. I don't know why that picture is misbehaving so much. All right, so we've got id, ego, and superego. What is the deal with these guys? What's the story? Well, the id is the most primitive part of personality. So let me just add in some notes like I typically do here. This is the most primitive part of personality. And it houses, as it says on the slide here, our most basic biological urges. So sexual impulses, aggressive impulses, hunger and thirst, and really basic sort of animalistic stuff is housed within the id. And the id abides by, or adheres to, or is driven by the pleasure principle. Okay? What's the pleasure principle? Well, in the old days, it was a Janet Jackson album. But in terms of Freud's model, the pleasure principle is an approach to things where what you want is satisfaction and gratification now. Satisfaction/gratification now, regardless of costs or consequences. Okay? So if I am driven simply by my id, I don't care about whether I might get in trouble, for example, for acting on aggressive or violent impulses, okay? The id says, you know, if you're pissed off at your boss at work and you want to hit her in the head with a brick, then do it. Do it now, right? Immediate gratification. You might get in trouble. You might lose your job. You might get arrested. I don't care. The id wants to just feel good about having checked off that urge as being satisfied, as having addressed that impulse. Now, obviously, if that was the only thing driving personality, we'd be in pretty big trouble. The good news is we've got a counterbalance, and the counterbalance is actually down the bottom here. The counterbalance is the superego, which represents the internalized rules of our parents, and through our parents, the rules of society. I like to think about the superego as basically being our conscience. You have to spell that right because we've got all this conscious and unconscious stuff here. So our conscience, our sense of right or wrong, is the place where we basically have lots of primitive do's and don'ts. Okay? So we've got this list of things that we are allowed to do or things that we're not supposed to do, right? So if you have the 10 commandments housed within your superego, right? This list of thou shalt not, ... all these different things that you're not allowed to do, okay? One of them might be, it's not really one of them, but one of the prohibitions might be thou shalt not hit thy boss in the head with a brick. Okay, so now we've got tension, right? There's indubitably going to be tension and conflict between id and superego. Id wants to act on the impulses, and it doesn't care about consequences. That's what the pleasure principle is all about. The superego says, well, you can't do that. Okay, so how am I going to work this out? I need a pragmatic intermediary, and that's what the ego is. The ego is obeying the reality principle. And the reality principle basically is aimed at how can I meet the impulses of the id in the context of the real world and its real demands. Okay, so how can I meet its impulses in light of the real world and real demands, right? Real expectations, real sort of rules that are out there. So how can I sort of work a deal here, right? The ego's job is to find a compromise, right? Is to be the arbitrator, if you will, between the id and the superego, okay? And this is where, you know, sort of the best deals are made via the ego's function, because the id wants to just do things and it doesn't care what the consequences might be. And the superego has all these very rigid, primitive do's and don'ts, you know, lots of black and white stuff. And the ego's trying to work something out here, okay? Let me stop there for a second. Any questions about each of these individually? I'm looking at this, and this is 2 or 3 test questions right here about these different parts of personality. You feel like you got it? It would be great if you told me you got it. Thank you, Francisco. Okay? Let me ask you this. Could you imagine if id, ego, and superego came to SDSU and they got assigned to be roommates together? Tell me what that would look like. Is that going to work out well? Probably not. Inevitably, there are going to be conflicts between and among id, ego, and superego, and it might be like what Diana is dealing with herself, unfortunately. Sorry. So on the next slide here, I'm saying, yeah, they're not going to get along real well. And what's going to happen, most likely, is we're going to see anxiety levels being driven up. Why? Because, well, there's all this tension. It wants to act on impulses. Superego has all these rules. Ego's like, oh my God, can't we all just get along? There's lots of anxiety. There's lots of tension. Freud's model then suggests that what we do is we turn to the use of defense mechanisms to try to combat, to try to deal with the conflicts between and among id, ego, and superego. Okay? I'm going to begin with this first defense mechanism known as repression on this slide, and then I'm going to give you 4 more on the next slide, and then we're going to run through each of those. So in the next 10 minutes, you're going to learn about 5 different defense mechanisms. Here's the deal with repression. It's the easiest one. You know what you do when you repress something? You don't think about it. So this is the just bury it defense mechanism. Simplest way to think about repression, right? So if there is anxiety present, what this defense mechanism says to do is just not think about it, okay? Distract yourself with something else. Don't even consider it. Don't toss and turn at night worrying about it. Just let it go, right? Bury it and push it out of conscious awareness, okay? Push it down, going back to the iceberg analogy, right? Push it down in the iceberg so that you don't need to address it. You don't need to consider it. That's the most primitive, the most basic of our defense mechanisms, but we have others that we use. The others are listed on the right side of this slide. So let me just jump in here and put in repression as the first of these. These other guys are aimed at, again, alleviating anxiety, whether we're talking about repression, displacement, reaction formation, rationalization, or projection. All of them are strategies that we use to avoid conflicts that come up when id, ego, and superego don't get along with each other, okay? Now, if I want to make Freud roll over in his grave, what I could suggest here is, you know what? When we use defense mechanisms to alleviate anxiety, what does that sound like? And it's not a Freudian idea or term. When you find something that helps you reduce anxiety, what is that? What kind of operant conditioning scenario are we describing there? And please don't make me cry. It sounds like that emotion-focused coping, and we said when you do that, what kind of operant conditioning scenario is that? You do the behavior and it helps you get rid of or avoid, in this case, anxiety. What do we have going on there? Yeah, it's negative reinforcement. Thank you for that. Montana gets 12 bonus points for that. Fantastic, right? We're not necessarily consciously aware of the fact that we're doing repression or displacement or any of these others, but they're helping us because they're alleviating, they're reducing, and maybe completely eliminating the anxiety that we had from these conflicts between and among id, ego, and superego. So here's what I want to do. I want to run through these others. We've already talked about repression, just bury it. I'm going to try to give you, one brief little summary of each of them, and then we'll do a polling question or two to see if you guys can do what I'm going to ask you guys to do on Tuesday with these. I'm looking at this list of 5. This is probably another 2 or 3 test questions. Right? I said 11 on personality, probably a couple questions on id, ego, and superego, and probably a couple questions here on these defense mechanisms. All right, let's run through these together. Displacement. If repression is the just bury it defense mechanism, this is what I call the drag and drop defense mechanism. And what we're dragging and what we're dropping is something that's going on in one context that we can't address in that context. So it says here, desires that can't be fulfilled in one context may be displaced onto another. So let's pretend that this guy is overwhelmed by the pressure at work. And, well, he decides not to hit his boss in the head with a brick, but that unfulfilled aggression, that violent or aggressive impulse that he doesn't act on at work might reveal itself at home. And he's not going to be violent towards his spouse, let's say here. But what he does is he has a short fuse. He gets really angry, or maybe he yells at her, right? I would be doing displacement if on Tuesday you guys end up with a class average of 50. It's not going to happen, right? And then I went home, and because I was so mad about what happened with the test here and the poor performance of my class, and I started yelling at my kids for nothing. They're like, I didn't even do anything. I'm doing the old drag and drop displacement defense mechanism, right? I don't yell at my students at school, but I come home and yell at them, or I come home and kick the dog. We don't have a dog, so that's not really a real thing, but you get the idea. So we've got repression, we've got displacement, we've got reaction formation, number 3 here on the hit parade of defense mechanisms. This is the do the opposite defense mechanism. What does this mean? Well, I might really, really love someone, but they don't reciprocate that love. So I turn the love into hate, okay? Do the opposite. So an unrequited love means they don't love you back, okay? Or maybe I really, really hate the fact that I have a brand new baby sister. I'm 4 years old, and I like being the center of my parents' universe. And now this new baby comes home. Got this new baby sister, and I hate her. But I know I'm not allowed to say that because everybody who comes by seems to love her. So I turn the hate into love, and I smother her with affection, okay? So it's the do the opposite scenario. You could see lots of reaction formation stuff going on, on the playground in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, right? One of the little boys really likes one of those little girls, but he's not going to, say that. So he's going to tease her or pull her hair or chase her around during recess, something like that, okay? So we've got repression where we just bury it, displacement where we drag it and drop it somewhere else, reaction formation where we do the opposite, okay? We're making some pretty good progress here. What's up next? What's up next is coming up with a reasonable sounding excuse. It's called rationalization. So if I were to summarize this, this is trying to come up with a reasonable sounding excuse, right? You might say, I beat my children for their own good. It's to help them become better, okay? Unacceptable behaviors. This is sort of the spin zone, right? I'm reinterpreting unacceptable behaviors as positive. I'm trying to do something to sort of make myself feel better about what's going on. I can't reach the grapes. This is actually from Aesop's Fables, right? So what do I say? They're sour grapes. Go to the movies. I'm dying to see some movie. I get there. It's sold out. What do I say? It's probably not very good anyway. Okay? These are all reasonable sounding excuses. Your roommate. Pretend it's one of Diana's roommates that she's got all these conflicts with. Your roommate says, hey, don't you have a test on Tuesday? And you're like, yeah. And they're like, well, why aren't you studying? You're like, well, it turns out that studying doesn't really help in this class. That's interesting. A reasonable sounding excuse. I don't know how reasonable that is, but you get the idea here with rationalization. You're trying to explain something away. Okay. So what have we done? Repression, displacement, reaction formation, rationalization, one final defense mechanism, and then I'll stop and see if anybody's completely lost. The final one is called projection. Okay. And this is the situation, kind of like the projective personality testing, where we are throwing something onto something else. And in this case, what's going on is I am not admitting to feeling jealous of the other woman. I'm saying she is jealous of me. Okay. My own blocked desires get projected onto someone else. Okay. So I do really, really think that I'm pretty sure, I feel pretty strongly that I hate my boss, okay? But I don't want to admit to feeling that way towards her. So what do I say? If I'm doing projection, what do I say? Tell me in the chat box. Instead of saying, I hate my boss, I project the feelings of hatred onto her and say what? Yeah, she hates me, right? So whether it's hatred or jealousy or whatever it is, it's almost one of these situations where you don't want to admit to feeling a certain way. And instead you say those feelings belong to that other person. You project them onto them. It's just like when parents force their children to do sports they wanted to do when they were young. Potentially, yeah. I mean, if that helps you get your head around the idea of projection, I could see it being argued that, that's a little bit of projection, right? Again, the central notion is you don't want to admit to feeling some way. So there's this girl that you really like who lives in your dorm. You don't want to admit to feeling that way. So what do you say? She really likes me. Like, she actually made eye contact with me yesterday. So I know what's going on there. Something like that, right? All right. So those are 5 different defense mechanisms. If we scroll back for a minute to the overview slide, right? Repression, displacement, reaction formation, rationalization, and projection. Let me stop there for a second. Any questions on those 5? Could you recognize a depiction of one of them? Or 2 of them? Or maybe 3 of them? Let's do a polling question, and then we'll use our last 25 minutes to finish the remaining theories. Let's do this one. So give it a shot. If you're choosing D, tell me why you think it's D. Yeah, a reasonable sounding excuse. They're making excuses, right? Maybe he really is just a cheapskate, but he says parental financial aid prevents teenagers from developing into mature, independent adults. Yeah, very good. All right. I'm pleased to see you guys get your head around that one. How about this one? A religious leader who attempts to overcome his hidden doubts with intense expressions of spiritual certainty is exemplifying which of those? And then explain your answer choice if you would, if you're choosing A or B or whatever you're choosing there. Yeah, what are the opposites here? Yeah, he's doing the opposite. I mean, there are 2 words in the question that are opposites, right? Doubt and certainty. Fantastic. Thanks for that, Matthew, right? what we've got is a guy who actually feels these doubts, but he's expressing spiritual certainty, right? Doing the opposite is what we've got going on there. Fantastic. All right, 23 minutes left, and we've got quite a ways to go. So let me keep rolling here. I'm going to just very briefly to say here, I'm not asking a test question on this, but basically the criticisms around Freud are around all the sex and aggression. There are also criticisms scientifically in terms of all these unobservables, right? This is what we talked about earlier on in that great debate discussion in the first week of class, right? The behaviors are like, dude, you've got all this unobservable stuff. We can't do work with that in a scientific way, right? I can't operationally define and measure these things that, you know, you're saying are driving behavior because they're unobservables. They're this unconscious stuff. So for a number of different reasons, there are criticisms of Freud, and along comes some other theories that are alternatives. Well, one of the major alternatives that is really a direct reaction, especially to all the sex and aggression that Freud says are the impulses that drive our behavior, comes from humanistic theory, which is based on the work of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So Maslow is this guy here. Carl Rogers is that guy there. When I taught this in the fall, I called Carl Rogers Aaron Rodgers because I had football on the brain. These guys, in contrast with Freud, don't think that we should talk about the drivers of our behavior being unconscious forces and sex and aggression and hang-ups from our childhood and all this kind of stuff, okay? They said instead what we should focus in on is what makes us human, free choice and self-determination. Good one, Kristen. Yeah. They said we should strive on our growth potential, right? What are we moving towards? What are our goals? Rather than like this weird hang-up you have from the way that you were potty trained as an infant. It feels a lot different. So one of the things I want you to get from this humanistic theory is that it is a much more positive and optimistic model in contrast with Freud's ideas, right? There's a lot of stuff in Freud that's like, man, this doesn't sound really good in terms of what makes people tick. These guys instead, as humanists, think that we should think about and focus on like our striving towards self-actualization. This is a Maslow idea, right? This is the idea of trying to be all you can be, right? Or striving to maximize your potential. So if you're striving right now towards self-actualization, you individually are trying to be the best student you can be, the best roommate you can be, the best coworker you can be, the best boyfriend or girlfriend you can be, the best son or daughter you can be, right? When you're striving towards that, that's trying to maximize your potential. Okay, so that's from Maslow. The other idea from Maslow is the hierarchy of needs. Okay, the hierarchy of needs here, again, is another Maslow idea. And there's certainly some overlap here between some of these humanistic ideas, Francisco, and some of the positive psychology today. I think you could probably trace the roots of the positive psychology movement today back into some of these ideas from Maslow and Rogers. That's really, again, why I want to emphasize this positive and optimistic tone here. So I'm going to review with you briefly the hierarchy of needs, partly because we're running out of time, but partly because I like to keep this simple. And I want you to understand two things about the hierarchy of needs. You don't need to memorize all the different levels and lists of the needs here. I want you to understand two things. I'm going to type them in down the bottom. Number one, I want you to understand that we move up as lower needs are met. And number two, we move down if lower needs are unmet. Okay, what does that mean? Here's what it means. It's sort of like checking off items on your to-do list. If your physiological needs have been addressed, you're now able to move up to the next level. I don't want it to be yellow, I can't see it. We're going to move up from physiological to safety, and then from safety, we'll address those. We're going to move up to this one, and then to esteem, and then we're going to strive towards self-actualization. So it's sort of a hierarchical progression here towards higher and higher levels of striving, we try to self-actualize. We try to, again, be all we can be, as we talked about before, and maximize your potential. But if you're striving towards self-actualization, let's say that there's some kind of horrific natural disaster, just to put a nice positive spin on things, what's going to happen is you're going to need to drop back down from here to here and figure out where you're going to be sleeping tonight and where your next meal is going to come from. Okay, so that's the pair of things I want you to be aware of with respect to this hierarchy of needs, right? We progress up when we check off the lower level needs, but if something goes wrong and we're working on a higher level need, down below, something sort of in the foundation gets wobbly, we go down and we readdress it. Those are the two things I want you guys to understand about this. Okay? Any questions on that at all? Do you see the much more positive tone to that? As Francisco's asking, yeah, this sounds like more of the positive psychology stuff that you'll see today. It's definitely a different feel. I do want to mention this in passing real quickly, a sort of funny reformulation of this that I saw last week over at my son's school. We were meeting with his 9th grade dean, making his 4-year plan for high school and different courses he was going to be taking. And she had Maslow's hierarchy of needs on the wall. And at the base, and I couldn't find the picture of this before class today, I forgot. They had below physiological needs, they had Wi-Fi. Was listed as the most basic human need at this point. You don't need to memorize this list from top to bottom or bottom to top. You do need to be able to recognize this idea of we progress up the hierarchy of needs as lower needs are addressed, and we've built that foundation, but we need to go back down and rebuild the foundation if something were to go wrong and we weren't adequately addressing the physiological or safety needs, for example. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So what do we got? 2 models left then, Bandura and Cattell, and we've got 15 minutes to do it. We're in better shape than I was in the 8 o'clock section. What does Bandura say makes us tick here in terms of personality? Well, he's got 3 major ideas that I want to highlight for you this morning. Remember, he's the Bobo doll guy, right? The observational learning guy. So not surprisingly, his first big idea is that personality development is shaped by observational learning, okay? So if you learn to be outgoing and talkative in the life of the party, it may be because you saw that in family and friends. If you learn the importance of being on time for things, being conscientious in that regard, maybe you saw that within your own family, or maybe you didn't, and you always run late for everything, okay? So you are the way that you are, at least in part, according to Bandura, because of what you observed and presumably what you saw get rewarded in those folks around you, moms and dads and brothers and sisters and friends and so forth. That's the first big idea. The second big idea is pretty straightforward. It's the idea of reciprocity between and among thoughts, environment, and behavior. Reciprocal determinism is more complicated than really the concept is about. Basically, what reciprocal determinism means is that there are 2-headed arrows that connect these different factors over here. So behavior and thoughts and feelings about risky activities. We're talking about rock climbing, right? Behavior and environmental factors. They have a feedback connection between them, right? Those environmental factors and your thoughts and feelings about risky behaviors like rock climbing, for example. Okay. Reciprocal determinism basically boils down to thinking about 2-headed arrows. That's the way I'd really try to simplify this. When we talk about reciprocal relationships, it means A affects B just like B affects A. Think about and connect this back in your mind to the reciprocity that we talked about between infants and their parents. When we were discussing attachment, right? Prior to spring break, we said, there's this dance, what the child brings and what the parent brings. There's reciprocity there. That's what Bandura is getting at here, right? There's these back and forth relationships between these two, okay? Or in this case, these 3 factors. The third and final factor that he tries to draw in as a big driver of our personality is self-efficacy. This is actually my favorite of the 3. I think this is a huge concept. I think it's important for real life here. Here's the idea. Self-efficacy, if we define it, is the belief that you can perform adequately in a particular situation. That last little phrase there is what makes it different from self-esteem, right? Self-esteem is sort of a general overall feeling about yourself. Self-efficacy is sort of like your belief that you've got the items necessary on this checklist to perform adequately, to be successful in a given situation. So it could be with respect to your self-efficacy beliefs about being able to pass your physics class, or about being good enough as a musician to be invited to be in this orchestra. Or it could be about your interpersonal skills to be successful as a salesperson. Those are all self-efficacy beliefs. Do I have what's necessary to do A, B, C, and D and succeed in one of those three examples I just talked about? Okay. Why does it matter? This is the part I really love, right? Self-efficacy matters because it influences not only how hard you try, but I think this is the most important part, how long you persist. Because here's the deal. If you haven't discovered this in your life already, you're going to face adversity. Stuff is not going to go well. How are you going to respond? We were talking about college admission stuff the other day. How are you going to respond when you don't get into maybe your dream school, right? How are you going to respond when you do poorly on a physics quiz or a test, okay? Think about it. If you have high self-efficacy beliefs, you don't quit, right? I did poorly on one quiz, no problem. I know I've got this, right? I've got what's required to be successful here. So again, not only how hard you try, but I think, again, more importantly, how long you keep on keeping on when the going gets tough, because it's going to get tough, okay? Almost anything worthwhile in life isn't something that comes easily. I'm getting a little bit preachy here, but you get the idea, okay? Does this sound like any story from your childhood where there was a character who thought he could do something and he kept telling himself that, I think I could do this, and he ultimately was able to? Basically, he had high self-efficacy beliefs. Do you remember a character who said to himself, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can? Diana's got it. The little engine that could, right? The little engine that could. If your parents were even halfway decent as parents, somewhere along the line, they would have exposed you to that story, right? It's about persistence. It's about self-efficacy. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. That's one of my favorite stories for little kids, in addition to Goodnight Moon and The Great Green Room. You remember that? Yeah, sure. Let me stop there. Any questions about these three big factors from Bandura? Observational learning, reciprocal determinism, and self-efficacy. I think I have almost that entire book memorized. In The Great Green Room, there was a telephone and a big balloon or green balloon or something. I could probably do a fair amount of it. All right, 10 minutes to go. Let's wrap up Bandura's contribution here and go to our final model of personality, which is the 5-factor model, okay? Raymond Cattell in the late 1950s seeks to develop what we would call, in fancy terms here, an empirically derived model. You don't need to know that term for the test, but empirically derived means based on observations. What he does is he starts with 4,500 trait words from an unabridged dictionary. That's like the dictionary is like 5 or 6 inches thick, right? Those trait words, friendly, outgoing, dependable, lazy, thoughtful, considerate, etc., tended to group together when he asked thousands of people to rate themselves on these different dimensions. They clumped into about 16 different personality dimensions originally. And when he kept boiling the soup here, if you will, by doing some factor analysis, where you look for the underlying factors in your questionnaire or your survey or whatever your instrument is, ultimately those 16 were able to be boiled down into the big 5 factors that we actually looked at back on the slide when we were talking about The heritability, the nature versus nurture issue, is it maps onto personality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name the big 5 factors on the next slide. I'm going to describe sort of what it looks like if you're low or high on each of those dimensions. And what I'm going to encourage you to do as we start looking at these is think about either people from your real life or maybe characters from TV shows or movies who are relatively higher or lower on these different dimensions. Okay, so we're going to do low on the left here. Sounds like somebody's going to come through the wall of my office here. And over here on the right, we're going to list this as folks who are high on these different dimensions. Okay, let me just stretch this out. Good. All right, so the 5 dimensions are as follows: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. What do you notice about the 5? How are you going to remember these? They spell ocean. They actually also spell canoe, so you could connect either one of those, but whatever. Openness is often referred to as openness to experience. It's basically about your willingness to try new things or not, right? So if I'm high on this dimension, I might be described as unconforming, creative, imaginative, just kind of willing to take risks. If I'm low on that openness to experience dimension, I'm conforming, I'm uncreative, I'm relatively simple and practical, okay? I don't want to go and try a bunch of whole new different kinds of foods if I'm low on openness to experience. Conscientiousness. This matters when you're a teacher or you're a coach or you're a boss. You want folks who are high on the conscientiousness dimension. They're reliable, they're ambitious, they're punctual, right? They're responsible, they're dependable. If they're low on this dimension, they're unreliable, lazy, spontaneous. If you're waiting for your friend to pick you up at the airport, you hope that they score high on the conscientiousness dimension. If you have a friend who's low on this dimension, you might call them and say, hey, I thought you were picking me up. They're like, oh, dude, I knew there was something I was supposed to do. Extroversion, how outgoing are you? If you're sociable, talkative, affectionate, life of the party, you're on the high end of this dimension. If you're a loner, you're more quiet, reserved, and shy, you're low on that extroversion dimension. Agreeableness, how easy are you to get along with? Are you good-natured or are you irritable? Low on this dimension, rude, uncooperative, irritable, right? Negativistic, grouchy, right? On the high end of this, low maintenance. You're good-natured, you're trusting, you're helpful, you're, cooperative. You're easy to get along with if you're high on agreeableness, right? When you're going out to dinner and hanging out with friends and, there's a 20-minute wait to get seated at the restaurant where the movie is sold out. You want your high agreeableness friends with you. You don't want the ones who are going to bitch and moan the rest of that night and the rest of the weekend about the dinner or the movie. Finally, neuroticism. You want your star quarterback to be low on the neuroticism scale. You want him to be cool, calm, and collected. Okay? You're composed if you're low on neuroticism. You're even-tempered, you're secure. If you're highly neurotic, you're a worrywart. You're emotional, you're temperamental, you're always anxious, you're really kind of excitable, you worry all the time. Okay? That's the idea here on that dimension. Okay? Any questions about the big 5 factors of personality? Could you recognize a description? I'm going to give you a chance to do so with a final polling question today. So let me grab that, and then we'll be ready to wrap up. So here's the final question I have for you. Austin's telling me it's conscientiousness because she's on time, she's reliable, she's ambitious, all that stuff, yeah. Fantastic. You guys are on that, right? And if you're a teacher, and that's the kind of student you want. They're the ones that you'd like to have your class full of, instead of the people that are going in the opposite direction, right? Less studious, less hardworking, late all the time, never turning in things on time. They're the ones that cause you the headaches. All right. So we accomplished a rather ambitious goal, getting through this entire section on personality in less than 75 minutes. Well, I guess we're actually at 75 minutes because I started 3 minutes early. Any final questions on either personality or really anything from part 2 of our course? Remember the breakdown, right? 8 on intelligence, 11 on development, 10 on emotion, stress, and health, and then 11 on this personality section. So 40 questions on Tuesday. You've got the learning curve quizzes then due Monday night at 11, so make sure you get those done. It's 2 chapters worth. It's emotion, stress, and health, and personality, so it's an easy 20 points if you sit there and keep answering questions. Yeah, we skipped motivation. There's just, I can't cover it all, but you could certainly read that or skim that if you're interested in that motivation stuff. I just can't do it all. All right? Any other final questions for me? If you want to touch base with me during online office hours, I'm going to start those at 11. You just click on the button on Blackboard that says online office hours. I'll be available to you guys until noon today. All right? Any final questions or comments for me today? You're welcome, Francisco. That's everything I got. All right, so I am going to close out of this sharing and kill this session for today. So